How the British Empire became the biggest in the world. Welcome to our channel. Before starting, please like and subscribe for more stories. The British Empire, which would eventually cover nearly a quarter of the world's land and population, began its journey during the Age of Exploration. To understand how this empire rose to such heights, we must go back to the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a period defined by European nations racing to explore and conquer new lands. At the time, England was a relatively small and isolated kingdom, far from the dominant global force it would later become. However, this was the era that planted the seeds of what would grow into the largest empire the world has ever known. England's foray into exploration began under King Henry VII, who commissioned Italian navigator John Cabot to explore the New World. In 1497, Cabot reached Newfoundland, marking one of England's earliest ventures into transatlantic exploration. Though this did not result in immediate colonization, it signaled England's entry into a global race dominated by the maritime powers of Spain and Portugal. These nations were already reaping the rewards of their discoveries, Spain from its vast territories in the Americas and Portugal from its control over trade routes to Asia. England, however, was determined not to be left behind. In the following decades, England's maritime ambitions grew. The reign of Queen Elizabeth I marked a turning point as the kingdom began to establish itself as a significant seafaring nation. Privateers like Sir Francis Drake played a dual role as explorers and plunderers, raiding Spanish ships for gold and silver while circumnavigating the globe. These acts, though controversial, not only enriched England but also laid the groundwork for its growing confidence in naval power. The defining moment came in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. England's smaller and more agile navy outmaneuvered the vast Spanish fleet, securing its dominance over the Atlantic and signaling a new era for English exploration and expansion. With its naval power secured, England began to focus on colonization. Its first attempts, however, were fraught with difficulties. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh established the Roanoke colony on an island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Known as the Lost Colony, Roanoke mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind little more than speculation as to the fate of its settlers. Despite this failure, England remained undeterred. The first successful English colony was established in 1607 at Jamestown, Virginia. This settlement faced immense challenges in its early years, including food shortages, disease, and conflicts with Native American tribes. However, the cultivation of tobacco transformed Jamestown into a viable and profitable colony, setting a precedent for future settlements. Tobacco became a highly sought-after commodity in Europe, providing the economic foundation for England's expansion in North America. Religious motivations also played a significant role in England's early colonization efforts. In 1620, a group of English Puritans, later known as the Pilgrims, fled religious persecution in England and established the Plymouth colony in present-day Massachusetts. The Pilgrims sought to create a society based on their religious ideals, and their success inspired further waves of migration to the New World. Over time, these religiously motivated settlers became an essential part of England's growing network of colonies. By the mid-17th century, England's colonial ambitions extended beyond North America. The Caribbean became a focus of English expansion, with colonies such as Barbados and Jamaica established as key centers of sugar production. The harsh labor conditions on these plantations, driven by the transatlantic slave trade, underscored the darker side of England's imperial ambitions. Nevertheless, the wealth generated from the colonies in the Americas helped finance further exploration and expansion. These early efforts marked the beginning of the British Empire, driven by a combination of economic opportunity, religious zeal, and competition with European rivals. England's growing naval power, coupled with its strategic establishment of colonies, set the stage for what would become a global empire. The foundation was laid, and over the next few centuries, these small footholds would evolve into the vast and interconnected territories of the British Empire. Trade and commerce were fundamental to the expansion and success of the British Empire. While military power and colonization played vital roles, it was Britain's ability to dominate global trade networks that truly transformed it into an economic powerhouse. This economic engine not only financed Britain's imperial ambitions, but also allowed it to establish lasting influence over vast territories around the world. The story of trade and the British Empire begins in the early 17th century, with the establishment of the East India Company in 1600. Granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I, the East India Company was given the right to trade with Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with a particular focus on the lucrative markets of India and Southeast Asia. This marked the start of a new era in which trading companies became the driving force behind British expansion. Unlike modern corporations, these companies wielded extraordinary powers, including the authority to establish settlements, negotiate treaties, and even maintain private armies. The East India Company became the prototype for other trading ventures and was instrumental in shaping the empire. Britain's growing focus on trade was part of a broader European phenomenon. During this period, nations competed fiercely to control trade routes and monopolize access to valuable commodities like spices, textiles, and precious metals. The East India Company quickly established trading posts along India's coastline and began exporting goods like cotton, silk, and indigo back to England. The company's success depended on its ability to build relationships with local rulers, many of whom granted the British favorable trading rights in exchange for military support or payments. Over time, these relationships transformed into political control, laying the groundwork for British rule in India. Another critical aspect of Britain's trade-based empire was the Atlantic triangular trade, which linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This system became a cornerstone of the British economy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Manufactured goods, such as textiles, guns, and metal tools, were exported from Britain to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved people. These enslaved individuals were then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas in a harrowing journey known as the Middle Passage. Upon arrival, they were forced to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then shipped back to Britain and sold at enormous profit. The triangular trade had devastating human consequences, as millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands and subjected to inhumane conditions. Yet, from an economic perspective, it was immensely profitable and provided Britain with the resources it needed to finance further imperial ventures. The wealth generated by this trade fueled Britain's industrial development, helped it become one of the richest nations in the world. In addition to the triangular trade, Britain's dominance in the Caribbean played a significant role in its economic power. Colonies like Barbados and Jamaica became central to the production of sugar, one of the most valuable commodities of the time. The sugar trade was highly lucrative, and British merchants grew wealthy by exporting sugar to Europe and importing it to meet the growing demand among Britain's own population. These profits were reinvested into the economy, funding infrastructure projects, the navy, and further colonial expansion. By the late 17th century, Britain had begun to establish itself as a global trading hub. The Royal African Company, established in 1660, was tasked with expanding Britain's involvement in the slave trade and securing new markets in Africa. At the same time, British merchants and privateers were active in the Americas, where they competed with Spanish, French, and Dutch traders for control of lucrative commodities. The Navigation Acts, a series of laws passed by Parliament, ensured that colonial goods were shipped only to England, allowing Britain to maintain a monopoly over trade with its colonies. The 18th century marked a period of extraordinary growth for British trade, driven by several key developments. First, the establishment of new colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Africa expanded Britain's access to natural resources and labor. Second, the rise of the Industrial Revolution allowed Britain to mass-produce goods more efficiently than its rivals. British factories churned out textiles, tools, and other manufactured products that were sold across the empire, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of production and consumption. Colonies provided the raw materials, such as cotton from India and sugar from the Caribbean, needed to fuel these industries, while also serving as captive markets for British exports. One of the most significant drivers of Britain's economic dominance was its control of maritime trade routes. The Royal Navy, the most powerful in the world, played a crucial role in protecting British ships and securing access to strategic ports. Key naval victories, such as those during the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, allowed Britain to eliminate French competition and secure territories like Canada and India. These victories not only expanded Britain's territorial holdings, but also ensured its dominance over global trade for decades to come. In Asia, The East India Company continued to expand its influence, particularly in India. By the mid-18th century, the company had established control over vast territories, collecting taxes and exerting political authority over millions of people. The wealth generated from Indian trade, particularly in textiles and spices, became a cornerstone of the British economy. At the same time, British merchants began trading opium in China, leading to conflicts such as the Opium Wars, which further extended Britain's control over Asian markets. The importance of trade and commerce to the British Empire cannot be overstated. It was trade that provided the financial resources needed to build the Royal Navy, establish colonies, and maintain military dominance. It was trade that connected distant parts of the empire, creating an intricate web of economic relationships that span the globe. And it was trade that allowed Britain to sustain its position as the world's leading economic power for more than a century. However, the reliance on trade also had significant consequences. The exploitation of enslaved people, the displacement of indigenous populations, and the destruction of local economies were direct results of Britain's pursuit of wealth. These impacts are still felt today in many parts of the world. By the 19th century, Britain's trade networks were so extensive that it was often said, the sun never sets on the British Empire. From the bustling ports of London and Liverpool to the remote trading posts of India and Africa, the empire's economy was a testament to the transformative power of commerce. Trade was the lifeblood of the British Empire, and it remained central to its identity throughout its history. The British Empire's rise to global dominance was marked by its expansion across the Atlantic, encompassing colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and parts of West Africa. This Atlantic empire was built on exploration, colonization, trade, and the exploitation of enslaved labor. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain had firmly established itself as a major Atlantic power, laying the groundwork for an empire that would influence the modern world. One of the key moments in the development of the Atlantic Empire came in 1607 with the establishment of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Though initially plagued by disease, starvation, and conflict with indigenous peoples, Jamestown became viable due to the cultivation of tobacco. Tobacco became the colony's cash crop, exported to England in large quantities, generating enormous profits and setting a precedent for agricultural economies in other colonies. As settlers expanded, Britain established other colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America, such as Massachusetts Bay, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. These colonies had diverse origins. Some were driven by religious motivations, like the Pilgrims and Puritans seeking refuge from persecution, while others were founded for economic reasons. These early settlements became crucial nodes in Britain's colonial network, producing resources like timber, fur, and agricultural goods that fuel the empire's growing economy. By the mid-17th century, the British presence in the Americas extended beyond the mainland. The Caribbean became a central focus for imperial ambitions, with colonies such as Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua emerging as major centers of sugar production. Sugar quickly became one of the most valuable commodities in the Atlantic economy, often referred to as white gold. However, its production relied heavily on the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans, who were forced to work under inhumane conditions on plantations. The profitability of sugar helped Britain finance its global expansion, but it also entrenched the transatlantic slave trade as a cornerstone of the empire's economy. The triangular trade, which connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas, became a defining feature of the British Atlantic Empire. British merchants exported manufactured goods such as textiles, guns, and metal tools to West Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved individuals. These enslaved people were then transported across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the Caribbean and the southern colonies of North America. In return, raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and molasses were shipped back to Britain. This system generated immense wealth for British merchants, shipbuilders, and plantation owners, reinforcing Britain's position as a global economic power. The triangular trade also had devastating consequences for millions of Africans who were forcibly uprooted from their homelands, subjected to grueling voyages across the Atlantic, and forced into lifelong servitude. The Middle Passage, the journey of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, was marked by overcrowding, disease, and unimaginable suffering, with mortality rates often exceeding 15 to 20%. Despite the human cost, the profits from this trade became a major source of wealth for Britain, fueling its industrial growth and imperial ambitions. During this time, British colonies in North America and the Caribbean became increasingly interconnected. Ports like Boston, Charleston, and Bridgetown served as hubs for trade and communication, linking the colonies to one another and to Britain. The development of shipping routes, custom systems, and colonial administrations created a cohesive economic network that spanned the Atlantic. This network allowed Britain to dominate Atlantic trade and ensured that its colonies remained economically dependent on the mother country. The 18th century was a period of consolidation and expansion for the British Atlantic Empire. Key events, such as the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, and the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, allowed Britain to expand its territorial holdings. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 granted Britain control of territories such as Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Gibraltar, strengthening its Atlantic presence. Similarly, Britain's victory in the Seven Years' War marked a turning point, as it gained control of Canada and Florida, eliminating French competition in North America. The unification of England and Scotland in 1707 through the Act of Union also played a significant role in the expansion of the Atlantic Empire. The creation of Great Britain allowed the resources and talents of both nations to be pooled, leading to greater investments in trade, exploration, and colonization. Scottish merchants, in particular, became prominent figures in Atlantic trade, contributing to the empire's economic success. In addition to economic and territorial expansion, the British Atlantic Empire was characterized by its cultural and social dynamics. Colonists brought English laws, customs, and governance to the New World, creating societies that mirrored Britain in many ways. However, these colonies also developed unique identities, shaped by the blending of European, African, and indigenous cultures. The legacy of these interactions can still be seen in the languages, religions, and traditions of the Americas today. By the mid-18th century, the British Atlantic Empire was at its height, with colonies stretching from Canada to the Caribbean. However, this period of success was not without its challenges. Colonial unrest began to simmer as settlers grew dissatisfied with British policies, particularly those related to taxation and trade restrictions. This dissatisfaction would eventually culminate in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, which resulted in the loss of the 13 American colonies. Despite this setback, the British Atlantic Empire remained a vital part of the broader British Empire. The Caribbean colonies continued to generate immense wealth, and Britain shifted its focus to other parts of the world, particularly Asia and Africa. The lessons learned from the Atlantic experience, both its successes and its failures, shaped Britain's approach to empire building in the centuries to come. The expansion of the Atlantic Empire was a critical chapter in the story of the British Empire. It demonstrated Britain's ability to harness trade, resources, and human labor on an unprecedented scale, creating a network of colonies that spanned the Atlantic Ocean. While the wealth generated by this empire helped propel Britain to global prominence, its legacy is also marked by the exploitation and suffering of millions. Understanding the complexities of the Atlantic Empire provides a deeper insight into the forces that shaped the modern world. The British Empire's extraordinary expansion and dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries were intrinsically tied to the Industrial Revolution. This period of rapid technological and economic transformation gave Britain unprecedented advantages, allowing it to consolidate its global influence. The synergy between industrialization and empire created a cycle of mutual reinforcement. The empire provided raw materials and markets for British goods, while industrialization fueled the infrastructure, wealth, and innovation needed to maintain and expand imperial control. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 18th century, driven by advancements in technology, agriculture, and manufacturing. Inventions such as the spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam engine revolutionized textile production, enabling Britain to produce goods on a massive scale. Factories sprang up across the country, particularly in industrial hubs like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, transforming Britain into the workshop of the world. These cities became symbols of Britain's industrial might, producing textiles, iron, and machinery that were exported across the globe. One of the key factors that made industrialization possible was the empire itself. Colonies provided Britain with an abundant supply of raw materials, including cotton, sugar, and timber, which were essential for industrial production. For example, India became a major supplier of cotton, which was processed in British factories and transformed into textiles. Similarly, the Caribbean colonies supplied sugar, which not only became a staple in the British diet but also fueled the burgeoning consumer culture of the time. The relationship between Britain and its colonies was not purely extractive. It was also deeply exploitative. Colonies served as captive markets for British manufactured goods, ensuring a steady demand for products. British policies, such as the Navigation Acts, enforced trade monopolies that required colonial goods to be transported on British ships and sold exclusively to British merchants. This system created a cycle of economic dependence, as colonies were forced to rely on British imports while exporting their raw materials at prices controlled by British traders. Transportation and infrastructure played a critical role in the Industrial Revolution's impact on the empire. The development of railroads, canals, and steamships allowed goods to be transported more efficiently, both within Britain and across its global territories. The introduction of steamships, in particular, revolutionized maritime trade, reducing travel times and making it easier to move goods and people across vast distances. British engineers built railroads in colonies like India, Canada, and Australia, creating networks that facilitated the extraction of resources and the integration of colonial economies into the imperial system. The rise of industrial capitalism also transformed the financial foundations of the British Empire. Banking institutions, stock exchanges, and insurance companies grew rapidly to support industrial and imperial ventures. London became the financial capital of the world, with institutions like the Bank of England and Lloyd's of London playing central roles in funding trade, infrastructure projects, and military campaigns. The wealth generated by industry and trade allowed Britain to maintain its powerful navy, fund wars, and invest in colonial expansion. The Industrial Revolution also brought significant social changes, both within Britain and across the empire. In Britain, the shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy led to urbanization, as millions of people moved from rural areas to cities in search of work. This urban growth created a new class of industrial workers, whose labor was the backbone of Britain's economic success. At the same time, a growing middle class emerged, benefiting from the increased availability of consumer goods and opportunities for investment in the empire. Across the empire, the impact of industrialization was profound but often uneven. In India, for example, British policies prioritized the extraction of resources over the development of local industries. Indian weavers, who had once been renowned for their textiles, were put out of business by the flood of cheap British factory-made goods. This deindustrialization of India had long-lasting economic and social consequences, leaving the region dependent on British imports and undermining its traditional industries. Britain's industrial dominance was further bolstered by its technological innovation and ability to adapt. The development of advanced machinery, such as steam-powered ships and railways, gave Britain a strategic advantage in both commerce and warfare. For instance, the construction of the Suez Canal in 1869 drastically shortened the journey between Britain and its Asian colonies, particularly India. The canal, which came under British control in 1875, became a vital artery of imperial trade, allowing goods and military forces to move quickly between Europe and Asia. The wealth generated by industrialization also enabled Britain to project its power globally. The Royal Navy, the world's most formidable maritime force, was crucial in protecting trade routes, enforcing British interests, and maintaining the empire's territorial integrity. Naval bases and coaling stations were established around the world, from Singapore to Gibraltar, ensuring that British ships could operate effectively across vast distances. This maritime dominance allowed Britain to control key choke points, such as the Straits of Malacca and the Cape of Good Hope, further solidifying its global influence. The benefits of industrialization, however, were not equally distributed. While Britain grew rich from its empire, the costs of industrialization were often borne by the colonies. The exploitation of labor, particularly enslaved and indentured workers, was a fundamental aspect of the imperial economy. In the Caribbean, for example, enslaved Africans were forced to work on sugar plantations under brutal conditions, generating immense wealth for British planters and merchants. Even after the abolition of slavery in 1833, systems of indentured labor, where workers from India and China were recruited to replace enslaved workers. By the mid-19th century, Britain's industrial and economic dominance was unrivaled. The combination of technological innovation, a vast empire, and a highly developed financial system made Britain the world's leading economic power. The empire's ability to generate wealth through trade and industry allowed it to fund its military, expand its territories, and influence global politics. At the same time, the interconnectedness of industrialization and imperialism ensured that the British Empire remained at the center of global commerce for much of the 19th century. However, the reliance on industrialization also created vulnerabilities. By the late 19th century, other nations, such as Germany and the United States, began to industrialize and challenge Britain's economic supremacy. The British Empire's dominance in Asia, particularly in India, represented one of the most significant chapters in its history. The establishment of the British Raj, the period of direct British rule over the Indian subcontinent from 1858 to 1947, solidified Britain's control over one of the most populous and resource-rich regions in the world. This expansion into Asia was driven by trade, military conquest, and political maneuvering, transforming Britain into a global superpower while reshaping the societies and economies of the region. The origins of British control in India can be traced back to the early 17th century with the establishment of the East India Company in 1600. The company began as a trading enterprise, securing goods such as spices, textiles, and indigo for export to Europe. Initially, the British operated as one of many European powers in the region, competing with the Portuguese, Dutch, and French for influence. By forming alliances with local rulers and using its advanced naval power, the company gradually gained a foothold in key trading ports such as Bombay, Mumbai, Calcutta, Kolkata, and Madras, Chennai. One of the pivotal moments in British expansion in India came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where the forces of the East India Company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This victory marked the beginning of British political control in India, as the company transitioned from a purely commercial enterprise to a governing entity. Over the following decades, the company expanded its influence, using a combination of diplomacy, military force, and economic leverage to dominate vast territories. By the early 19th century, the British presence in India had grown so extensive that the East India Company effectively ruled large portions of the subcontinent. However, this rule was marked by exploitation and social disruption. British policies, such as the permanent settlement of Bengal in 1793, restructured land ownership systems, often to the detriment of Indian peasants. Traditional industries, particularly the textile sector, were undermined by the influx of cheap British manufactured goods, leading to economic decline in many regions. The mid-19th century was a turning point for British rule in India. In 1857, widespread dissatisfaction with company rule erupted into the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. This uprising was sparked by grievances among Indian soldiers, sepoys, in the company's army, who resented discriminatory practices and the use of animal fat in rifle cartridges, which offended both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. The rebellion quickly spread, with local rulers and peasants joining the fight against British authority. Although the uprising was ultimately suppressed, it exposed the vulnerabilities of company rule and led to significant changes in the administration of India. In 1858, in the wake of the rebellion, the British government dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct control of India, establishing the British Raj. Under the Raj, India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, providing valuable resources, labor, and revenue. The British introduced administrative reforms, modernized infrastructure, and expanded the railway network, connecting distant parts of the subcontinent and facilitating the movement of goods and troops. The construction of railways in India was one of the most visible symbols of British influence. By the late 19th century, India had one of the largest railway networks in the world, with over 20,000 miles of track. These railways were primarily designed to serve British economic interests, enabling the efficient extraction and export of raw materials such as cotton, jute, tea, and opium. While the railways created new opportunities for trade and travel, they also reinforced patterns of economic dependency, as Indian industries were often sidelined in favor of British imports. British rule in India was also marked by cultural and social changes. The British introduced Western-style education, legal systems, and governance, which were intended to create a class of Indians loyal to British interests. English became the language of administration and education, creating a cultural divide between the elite and the broader population. At the same time, British missionaries sought to spread Christianity, often clashing with Indian religious traditions and fueling resentment among the population. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, further enhanced Britain's control over its Asian territories. The canal provided a direct maritime route between Europe and India, reducing travel time and strengthening the economic and strategic ties between the two regions. Britain's purchase of a controlling stake in the canal in 1875 ensured that it could protect its vital link to India, which accounted for a significant portion of imperial revenue. While the British Raj brought modernization and infrastructure to India, it was also marked by economic exploitation and widespread poverty. Indian resources were heavily taxed to finance British wars and imperial projects, leaving much of the population impoverished. Famines became a recurring problem during British rule, with millions dying in events such as the Great Famine of 1876–78, which was exacerbated by British policies prioritizing exports over local needs. Beyond India, British expansion in Asia extended to other territories such as Burma, Myanmar, Malaya, Malaysia, and Singapore. These regions were strategically important for controlling trade routes and securing access to resources like tin, rubber, and spices. In the case of Burma, British forces gradually annexed the territory through a series of wars in the 19th century, integrating it into the Indian administration. Similarly, Singapore, founded as a trading post by Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819, became a vital hub for British commerce in Southeast Asia. British influence in Asia also extended to China, particularly during the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century. These conflicts, fought to secure British trade interests, resulted in the Treaty of Nanking, 1842, which granted Britain control of Hong Kong and opened Chinese ports to British merchants. The opium trade, driven by British exports from India, had devastating social and economic effects on China, but it underscored Britain's ability to dominate Asian markets. The British Raj and its broader expansion in Asia were central to the empire's global dominance. India, in particular, served as a linchpin of the empire, providing both economic wealth and military manpower. Indian soldiers fought in British campaigns around the world, from Africa to Europe, demonstrating the interconnectedness of the empire's territories. However, the legacy of British rule in Asia is complex, marked by both achievements and injustices. While the British introduced infrastructure and institutions, their policies often prioritized imperial interests over the well-being of local populations, leaving a lasting impact on the region. The British Empire's rise to become the largest in the world was built on the foundation of naval supremacy. From the 16th century to the height of its imperial power in the 19th century, Britain relied heavily on its navy to project power, protect its trade routes, and maintain control over its far-flung territories. The Royal Navy, widely regarded as the most formidable maritime force in history, was the cornerstone of this dominance and played an indispensable role in shaping the empire. The story of Britain's naval supremacy began in earnest during the reign of Henry VIII, who recognized the strategic importance of a strong navy. He invested heavily in shipbuilding, creating a fleet that could defend England's shores and challenge rival European powers. The construction of large warships like the Mary Rose and the establishment of naval dockyards in Portsmouth and Chatham marked the beginning of Britain's transformation into a maritime power. However, it was during the reign of Elizabeth I that England truly emerged as a naval contender. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a turning point, as the smaller, more maneuverable English ships outclassed the massive Spanish galleons. This victory not only secured England's independence from Spanish domination, but also established the foundation for its naval ambitions. From this point onward, the Royal Navy became central to England's and later Britain's foreign policy and imperial strategy. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain's naval power was inextricably linked to its economic and territorial expansion. The Navy played a vital role in protecting the trade routes that connected Britain to its colonies in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. The ability to secure these sea lanes allowed Britain to dominate global commerce, transporting goods such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and tea across vast distances. The Navy also safeguarded Britain's interests against rival powers, such as France, Spain, and the Netherlands, which competed fiercely for control of overseas territories. One of the key moments in Britain's rise to naval supremacy was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Often referred to as the First World War, this conflict saw Britain and its allies pitted against France in battles fought across Europe, North America, Caribbean, and India. The Royal Navy's dominance at sea proved decisive, enabling Britain to capture key French territories, including Canada and India. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the end of the war and established Britain as the preeminent global power, with a navy capable of projecting its influence across the world. The Royal Navy's success was underpinned by several factors, including technological innovation, skilled leadership, and the strategic use of naval bases. British shipbuilders were at the forefront of maritime technology, designing faster, more durable vessels equipped with powerful cannons. The introduction of ships of the line, large, heavily armed warships capable of engaging in fleet battles, gave the Royal Navy a significant advantage over its rivals. Meanwhile, commanders like Admiral Horatio Nelson demonstrated exceptional tactical skill, leading Britain to victories such as the Battle of Trafalgar 1805, where Nelson's fleet decisively defeated the combined French and Spanish navies. The Napoleonic Wars 1803 to 1815 further cemented Britain's naval dominance. During this period, the Royal Navy established a blockade of French ports, cutting off Napoleon's access to trade and resources. This blockade, combined with Britain's control of key maritime choke points, such as the Straits of Gibraltar and the English Channel, ensured that Britain could maintain its economic and military superiority. The defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 marked the beginning of a century of British naval dominance, often referred to as the Pax Britannica. Throughout the 19th century, the Royal Navy played a central role in maintaining the empire's global reach. Britain's strategy of controlling key maritime routes and establishing naval bases around the world ensured that its ships could operate effectively across vast distances. Ports like Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Singapore, and Hong Kong became critical hubs for refueling, repairs, and resupply. These bases not only supported the Navy, but also served as symbols of British power and facilitated the expansion of trade and communication networks. One of the most significant developments during this period was the shift from sail to steam power. The introduction of steamships in the early 19th century revolutionized naval warfare and commerce, allowing Britain to maintain its edge over rival powers. Steamships were faster, more reliable, and less dependent on wind conditions, enabling the Royal Navy to respond more quickly to threats and challenges. The construction of the Suez Canal in 1869 further enhanced Britain's naval capabilities, providing a direct route between Europe and Asia and reducing travel time to India, the empire's most valuable possession. Naval supremacy was not just about protecting trade and territory. It also played a key role in Britain's ability to expand its empire. The Navy was often the first point of contact between Britain and new territories, enabling exploration, conquest, and colonization. In Africa, for example, the Royal Navy was instrumental in suppressing the transatlantic slave trade during the 19th century, patrolling the West African coast and intercepting slave ships. While this anti-slavery mission was presented as a moral crusade, it also served Britain's imperial interests by allowing it to establish influence in the region. The Navy's role in Asia was equally significant. During the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, British naval forces defeated the Chinese Empire, securing trade concessions and territorial gains such as Hong Kong. These victories underscore the importance of maritime power in enforcing British economic and political interests, particularly in regions where local resistance to imperialism was strong. The Royal Navy's dominance reached its peak during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By this time, Britain's empire spanned a globe, and the Navy was unmatched in size and capability. However, this dominance came under threat with the rise of other naval powers, particularly Germany and the United States. The naval arms race of the early 20th century, characterized by the construction of massive battleships like the Dreadnought, highlighted the growing competition for maritime supremacy. While Britain retained its naval superiority during World War I, The cost of maintaining such a powerful fleet began to strain its resources. Naval supremacy was a cornerstone of Britain's imperial success, enabling it to protect its trade routes, project power globally, and maintain control over its vast territories. The Royal Navy's legacy is one of innovation, resilience, and strategic mastery, but it is also a reminder of the empire's reliance on military power to sustain its dominance. The late 19th century witnessed one of the most intense and rapid phases of imperial expansion in history, often referred to as the Scramble for Africa. This period, spanning roughly from 1880 to 1914, saw European powers carve up the African continent into colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence. Britain emerged as one of the dominant players in this race, acquiring vast territories that will become essential parts of its empire. The motivations behind Britain's actions in Africa were complex, encompassing economic, strategic, and ideological factors, and the consequences of this colonization continue to shape Africa and the world today. The roots of the scramble for Africa can be traced to the Industrial Revolution and the global changes it set in motion. By the late 19th century, European nations, including Britain, were searching for new markets, resources, and opportunities for investment. Africa, with its vast untapped wealth of minerals, fertile lands, and labor, presented an irresistible target. At the same time, European powers were engaged in a fierce competition for global dominance, and control of African territories became a symbol of national prestige. Britain's interest in Africa predated the formal scramble. By the early 19th century, the British had already established a presence in South Africa, Sierra Leone, and along the West African coast. Sierra Leone, founded in the late 18th century as a settlement for freed slaves, became an early foothold in West Africa. Similarly, Cape Colony in South Africa, originally a Dutch settlement, was seized by Britain during the Napoleonic Wars and became a key strategic location for controlling the sea route to India. However, the scramble for Africa accelerated in the 1880s, fueled by the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, where European powers formalized the rules for the colonization of Africa. Hosted by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the conference aimed to prevent conflicts among European nations by dividing the continent into spheres of influence. Notably, no African leaders were invited to participate, highlighting the imperial disregard for African sovereignty. For Britain, the conference marked the beginning of a concerted effort to expand its holdings across the continent. One of Britain's primary motivations during the scramble was the desire to secure control of the Nile River and its surrounding regions. The Nile was seen as a vital waterway connecting Britain's interests in Egypt and Sudan with its prized colony of India. British control of Egypt had been established in 1882, following military intervention to protect European investments in the Suez Canal, a critical route for trade between Europe and Asia. From Egypt, Britain sought to expand southward into Sudan, leading to a series of military campaigns against local resistance, including the Mahdist War 1881 to 1899. By the end of the war, Sudan was incorporated into the British Empire as part of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. Another major focus of British expansion in Africa was Southern Africa, a region rich in natural resources such as gold and diamonds. Figures like Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and politician, played a central role in extending British influence in the area. Rhodes, who founded the De Beers Diamond Company, envisioned a British-controlled territory stretching from Cape Town to Cairo, a vision often symbolized by the construction of a transcontinental railway. Under Rhodes's leadership, Britain established colonies such as Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, further solidifying its dominance in southern Africa. The discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand region of South Africa in the 1880s added another layer of urgency to Britain's ambitions. The economic potential of the region sparked tensions between the British and the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, culminating in the Second Boer War 1899 to 1902. Although the war was costly in both human and financial terms, Britain ultimately emerged victorious, gaining control of the Boer republics and consolidating its dominance over South Africa. In East Africa, Britain focused on establishing control over territories that would secure its trade routes and resources. The colony of Kenya, for example, became a key part of Britain's East African holdings. The construction of the Uganda Railway, linking the port of Mombasa to the interior, facilitated the movement of goods and people while also enabling British military forces to suppress local resistance. Similarly, Britain expanded its influence in Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, and Uganda, integrating these regions into its broader imperial network. The British Empire's expansion into West Africa was driven by both economic and strategic interests. Colonies such as Nigeria, Ghana, then the Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone became important centers for trade and resource extraction. Nigeria, in particular, was rich in palm oil, a commodity essential for the industrial production of soap and lubricants. British trading companies, such as the Royal Niger Company, played a pivotal role in establishing control over the region. These companies often acted as quasi-governmental entities, negotiating treaties with local rulers and enforcing British interests. While economic and strategic considerations were paramount, the scramble for Africa was also shaped by ideological factors. The late 19th century was the height of the Victorian era, a time when Britain prided itself on its cultural and technological achievements. Many Britons believed it was their duty to civilize the peoples of Africa, a concept often referred to as the civilizing mission. This paternalistic attitude was deeply intertwined with the spread of Christianity, as British missionaries established schools, churches, and hospitals across the continent. While these efforts were often well-intentioned, they also disrupted traditional African cultures and imposed European values on local populations. Despite the lofty rhetoric of the civilizing mission, British rule in Africa was marked by exploitation and violence. The establishment of colonial economies often involved the forced labor of African populations who were compelled to work on plantations, in mines, or on infrastructure projects. Resistance to British rule was met with brutal repression, as seen in the suppression of uprisings such as the Ashanti Wars in Ghana and the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. By the early 20th century, Britain controlled an extensive network of African territories, stretching from the Mediterranean to the southern tip of the continent. This empire in Africa was a testament to Britain's ability to project power across vast distances and integrate diverse regions into its imperial system. However, the legacy of the scramble for Africa remains deeply contested. While British rule brought infrastructure, education, and technological advancements to some regions, it also caused profound social and economic disruptions, the effects of which are still felt today. The British Empire was not just a political or economic entity. It was also a profound cultural force. As Britain expanded its reach across the globe, it exported its language, religion, and customs to its colonies, leaving an indelible mark on the societies it governed. While this cultural influence was often framed as part of a civilizing mission, it was deeply intertwined with the processes of colonization and imperial control. The legacy of these cultural exchanges is complex, with lasting impacts that can still be seen in many former British colonies today. One of the most significant aspects of Britain's cultural influence was the spread of the English language. English became the language of governance, education, and commerce in many parts of the empire, serving as a unifying tool in diverse, multilingual societies. In India, for example, English was introduced as the medium of instruction in schools and universities during the 19th century, following reforms by figures like Lord Macaulay. His famous Minute on Education in 1835 argued that English should be promoted to create a class of Indians who would act as intermediaries between the British rulers and the broader population. The adoption of English allowed Britain to administer its colonies more effectively, but it also had unintended consequences. Over time, English became a symbol of opportunity and modernization. It continues to play a central role in the economic and political life of many former colonies. In addition to language, the British Empire introduced Western-style education systems to its colonies. Missionary societies and colonial administrations established schools and colleges to educate local elites, often emphasizing British values, literature, and history. Institutions such as St. Stephen's College in Delhi and Makerere University in Uganda became centers of learning, producing generations of leaders who were well-versed in British traditions but also critical of colonial rule. While these institutions contributed to the development of educated middle classes in many colonies, they also reinforced social hierarchies by privileging those who adopted British cultural norms. Religion played a central role in Britain's cultural influence, particularly through the activities of Christian missionaries. Missionary societies, such as the London Missionary Society and the Church Missionary Society, were active across the empire, spreading Christianity and establishing schools, hospitals, and churches. Missionaries often saw their work as a moral duty, believing that they were bringing salvation and enlightenment to uncivilized peoples. In Africa, for example, missionaries translated the Bible into local languages and introduced Western medical practices, which were often welcomed by local communities. However, their efforts also disrupted traditional belief systems and social structures, leading to cultural dislocation and resistance. The introduction of Christianity was particularly significant in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, where missionaries converted large numbers of people. Countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya saw the emergence of vibrant Christian communities, which integrated aspects of traditional African culture into their practices. In some cases, these communities became centers of resistance against colonial rule, as Christian leaders and organizations advocated for social justice and self-determination. However, the spread of Christianity was not universal. In India, for example, the majority of the population remained Hindu or Muslim, and missionary efforts were often met with suspicion and hostility. Alongside religion and education, Britain exported its legal and administrative systems to its colonies. English common law became the basis for legal systems in many parts of the empire, from Canada to India to Australia. The adoption of British legal principles, such as trial by jury and property rights, introduced a degree of uniformity to the administration of justice across the empire. However, these systems often clashed with local customs and traditions, leading to tensions and resistance. For instance, the imposition of British property laws in India disrupted traditional landholding patterns and contributed to economic inequality. British cultural influence also extended to the arts, sports, and leisure. The introduction of sports like cricket, rugby, and soccer became a hallmark of British imperial culture. Cricket, in particular, took root in colonies such as India, Australia, and the West Indies, where it became a unifying activity and later a symbol of national pride. Matches between colonial teams and their British counterparts were not just sporting events, but also opportunities to challenge imperial hierarchies. The West Indies cricket team, for example, became a powerful symbol of resistance to colonial domination, particularly during its dominance in the sport during the 20th century. Similarly, British literature and theater left a lasting impact on the cultural life of the colonies. Works by authors such as William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and Jane Austen were introduced to colonial audiences through schools and public readings. These texts were often used to promote British cultural values and ideals, but they also inspired local adaptations and reinterpretations. In India, for instance, Shakespeare's plays were translated into regional languages and performed in ways that reflected local traditions. Imperial exhibitions and world fairs also played a role in showcasing the cultural diversity of the British Empire while reinforcing the idea of British superiority. Events like the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London displayed goods, art, and artifacts from across the empire, emphasizing Britain's role as a global power and a unifying force. These exhibitions often portrayed colonized peoples as exotic and primitive, perpetuating stereotypes that justified imperial rule. At the same time, they provided opportunities for colonized societies to share their cultures with British audiences, creating moments of exchange and mutual influence. Despite these efforts to impose British culture, the process of cultural exchange within the empire was not one-sided. Colonized societies adapted and reshaped British customs to fit their own contexts, creating unique hybrid cultures. In India, for example, British architectural styles were blended with traditional Mughal and Hindu designs to create iconic buildings such as the Victoria Memorial in Kolkata. Similarly, Indian cuisine influenced British tastes, leading to the creation of dishes like chicken tikka masala, which became staples of British dining. The cultural legacy of the British Empire is deeply ambivalent. On the one hand, the spread of the English language, Western education, and legal systems provided tools for modernization and global integration. On the other hand, these efforts often came at the expense of local traditions and identities, leading to cultural dislocation and resentment. While the British Empire rose to unprecedented heights, becoming the largest empire in history, its dominance was constantly challenged by external rivals, internal unrest, and economic pressures. These challenges tested Britain's ability to maintain control over its vast territories and ultimately contributed to the empire's decline. From wars with competing powers to uprisings in the colonies, The British Empire faced significant obstacles throughout its history. One of the earliest and most significant challenges came during the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The 13 American colonies, which had been integral to Britain's Atlantic Empire, rebelled against British rule due to grievances over taxation, representation, and restrictions on westward expansion. The war was a costly and humiliating defeat for Britain, resulting in the loss of a large and economically important part of its empire. The independence of the United States marked the first major blow to Britain's imperial ambitions and demonstrated that colonial subjects could successfully challenge British authority. Despite this setback, Britain shifted its focus to other regions, particularly Asia and Africa, expanding its empire to unprecedented levels. However, these new territories brought their own challenges. In India, for example, British rule faced periodic uprisings and resistance from local rulers and populations. The most notable of these was the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. Sparked by discontent among Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army, the rebellion quickly spread across northern and central India. Although the British eventually suppressed the uprising, it exposed the weaknesses of company rule and led to the dissolution of the East India Company. The British government assumed direct control of India, marking the beginning of the British Raj. While the rebellion was contained, it left a lasting legacy of distrust and resentment among the Indian population. Economic challenges also posed significant threats to the British Empire. The Industrial Revolution, while a source of immense wealth and power, created economic dependencies between Britain and its colonies. Colonies were often forced to supply raw materials to British industries while importing British manufactured goods, leading to economic imbalances. Over time, this exploitation generated resentment among colonial populations who began to demand greater economic independence. Moreover, maintaining a global empire required enormous financial resources. The costs of administering colonies, building infrastructure, and defending trade routes placed a heavy burden on the British economy. Wars, in particular, strained Britain's finances. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, although ultimately a victory for Britain, left the country deeply in debt. Similarly, the Boer Wars, 1880 to 1881, 1899 to 1902, in South Africa were costly conflicts that exposed the limits of British military power and drew criticism from both domestic and international audiences. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain faced growing competition from other industrialized nations, particularly Germany and the United States. These emerging powers challenged Britain's economic and military dominance, leading to intense rivalries. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany in the early 20th century highlighted the growing threat to Britain's maritime supremacy. While Britain retained its status as the world's leading naval power, the competition forced it to divert resources to maintaining its fleet, weakening its ability to invest in other areas of the empire. The two world wars of the 20th century were perhaps the most significant challenges to the British Empire. World War I, 1914 to 1918, placed unprecedented demands on Britain, requiring it to mobilize resources and manpower from across the empire. Colonies such as India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand contributed troops and supplies to the war effort, demonstrating the empire's interconnectedness. However, the war also revealed the fragility of Britain's hold on its colonies. The economic strain of the war weakened Britain's ability to maintain control, while the sacrifices made by colonial populations fueled demands for greater autonomy and self-rule. World War II, 1939 to 1945, was an even greater challenge. Britain emerged from the war victorious but economically devastated, with its infrastructure damaged and its financial resources depleted. The war exposed the vulnerability of the empire, as key territories such as Singapore fell to enemy forces. Britain's reliance on support from the United States and the Soviet Union during the war also signaled a shift in global power dynamics. By the end of the war, it was clear that Britain could no longer maintain its empire in the face of rising nationalist movements and the growing influence of the United States and the Soviet Union. Nationalist movements within the colonies became a major force challenging British rule in the 20th century. In India, The Indian National Congress and leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru spearheaded the struggle for independence through campaigns of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. The Quit India movement of 1942 and the growing unrest during World War II made it increasingly difficult for Britain to justify its presence in India. In 1947, after years of negotiations and mounting pressure, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, marking the beginning of the decolonization process. Similar movements emerged in other parts of the empire. In Africa, nationalist leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya mobilized their populations to demand independence. The Mau Mau Uprising, 1952 to 1960, in Kenya highlighted the lengths to which Britain was willing to go to maintain control, but it also underscored the growing untenability of colonial rule. By the 1960s, many African nations had achieved independence, and the British Empire began to unravel. Economic challenges continued to plague Britain during the post-war period. The loss of colonial markets and resources, combined with the cost of rebuilding after World War II, weakened Britain's economy. The rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers further diminished Britain's influence on the global stage. By the 1970s, Britain had transitioned from an empire to a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies that maintained cultural and economic ties. The challenges to the British Empire were multifaceted, ranging from military defeats and economic crises to nationalist movements and geopolitical shifts. While Britain managed to adapt and survive many of these challenges, the cumulative effect eventually led to the decline of the empire. The process of decolonization reshaped the world, creating new nations and altering global power dynamics. Today, the legacy of these challenges can be seen in the political, economic, and cultural landscapes of former British colonies. The British Empire, at its peak, spanned the globe, encompassing nearly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. Although the empire officially dissolved in the mid-20th century, its legacy continues to influence the modern world in profound and complex ways. From the spread of English as a global language to the political, economic, and cultural systems established in former colonies, the imprint of the British Empire is enduring and multifaceted. However, this legacy is also marked by contradictions, as the empire brought both development and exploitation, unity and division, progress and suffering. One of the most visible legacies of the British Empire is the widespread use of the English language. Today, English is spoken by over 1.5 billion people, making it one of the most widely used languages in the world. In many former British colonies, including India, Nigeria, and South Africa, English serves as an official or second language, facilitating communication across diverse linguistic groups. The dominance of English in international business, science, and technology can be traced back to the British Empire's global reach. However, this linguistic legacy is not without controversy, as it often came at the expense of indigenous languages and cultures. The empire also left a lasting impact on political systems. Many former colonies adopted parliamentary democracy, inspired by the British model of governance. Countries such as Canada, Australia, and India retained political structures, legal systems, and constitutions that reflect British influence. For instance, the common law system, introduced during colonial rule, remains the foundation of the legal frameworks in numerous countries, from Jamaica to Kenya to Singapore. While these institutions provided a degree of political continuity after independence, they were often accompanied by challenges, as newly independent nations grappled with the legacies of authoritarian colonial administrations. Economically, the British Empire played a central role in shaping the modern global economy. The establishment of global trade networks during the imperial period laid the groundwork for today's interconnected world. Ports, railroads, and infrastructure built during British rule facilitated the movement of goods and people, integrating colonies into the global market. However, these systems were often designed to serve imperial interests, prioritizing the extraction of raw materials over the development of local industries. This exploitation left many colonies economically dependent on Britain, hindered their ability to achieve self-sufficiency after independence. The economic disparities created during colonial rule persist in many regions, contributing to underdevelopment and inequality. Another enduring aspect of the empire's legacy is the creation of the Commonwealth of Nations, an organization comprising 56 member states, most of which are former British colonies. Established in the mid-20th century, the Commonwealth aims to promote economic cooperation, cultural exchange, and political dialogue among its members. While the organization no longer reflects the imperial hierarchy of the past, it serves as a symbol of shared history and values. Events such as the Commonwealth Games and initiatives like educational scholarships help maintain connections between member states, even as they pursue independent paths. Culturally, the British Empire facilitated the exchange of ideas, traditions, and practices on a global scale. This cultural diffusion was bidirectional, as colonized societies influenced Britain as much as Britain influenced them. Indian cuisine, for example, became an integral part of British culture, with dishes like chicken tikka masala gaining iconic status. Similarly, Caribbean music and African art have enriched British cultural life. At the same time, British literature, sports, and educational systems left a lasting mark on former colonies. Cricket, a sport introduced by the British, became a passion in countries like India, Australia, and the West Indies, where it is now a source of national pride. However, the cultural legacy of the British Empire is also marked by the displacement and suppression of indigenous traditions. The imposition of British values, religion, and customs often marginalized local cultures, languages, and belief systems. In regions such as Australia and Canada, colonial policies led to the forced assimilation of indigenous peoples, including the establishment of residential schools that sought to erase native identities. These actions have left deep scars, and efforts to reconcile with this history are ongoing in many former colonies. One of the most controversial aspects of the British Empire's legacy is its role in shaping modern geopolitics. The arbitrary borders drawn by British administrators during the colonial period often ignored existing ethnic, cultural, and historical divisions. This legacy is particularly evident in Africa, where colonial boundaries contributed to conflicts and tensions that persist to this day. Similarly, the partition of India in 1947, which divided the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, led to mass displacement, communal violence, and ongoing tensions between the two nations. The empire also played a significant role in the development of global institutions and norms. Britain's influence in the 19th and early 20th centuries helped shape the rules of international trade, diplomacy, and governance. For example, the concept of free trade, championed by Britain during its imperial heyday, remains a cornerstone of the global economy. However, critics argue that these systems were often designed to benefit Britain and other Western powers, perpetuating imbalances of power and wealth. In the realm of social justice, the legacy of the British Empire is deeply contested. While some argue that the empire brought infrastructure, education, and legal systems to its colonies, others highlight the exploitation, violence, and inequality that accompanied imperial rule. The transatlantic slave trade, in which Britain played a central role, remains one of the darkest chapters in its history. Although Britain abolished slavery in 1833 and later positioned itself as a leader in the anti-slavery movement, the economic benefits derived from centuries of enslaved labor cannot be overlooked. In recent years, there has been growing debate about how to address the legacy of the British Empire. Movements such as Rhodes Must Fall, which began in South Africa and spread to the United Kingdom, have called for a re-evaluation of imperial figures and symbols. Statues of colonial leaders, the naming of institutions, and the teaching of imperial history in schools have all come under scrutiny. These debates reflect broader questions about how nations should confront their colonial pasts and the extent to which they should celebrate or critique the empire's legacy. Despite its complexities, the legacy of the British Empire is undeniable.